Welcome to UMBC in the Loop. I'm Joe Tatarewicz, a professor in the Department of History here at University of Maryland, Baltimore County, and director of the Human Context of Science and Technology program. I'm delighted to welcome today Sandra Herbert, my colleague in the History Department and the founding director of our program, who is here to talk with us about her career and Charles Darwin. Welcome, Sandra.
Thank you, Joe. I'm very glad to be here.
Now, how did you and Charles Darwin first meet?
In graduate school, really. I was an undergraduate biology major, and I shouldn't say major. I took biology courses in high school, 2 years, got interested in the subject, went to college and didn't take biology, took chemistry, physics, a lot of history and philosophy, and went to graduate school in the history of ideas at Brandeis University. And while in graduate school, I discovered the notebooks of Darwin that he kept when he was becoming an evolutionist. He called them his transmutation notebooks. And I found them so fascinating because he talked about how he became an evolutionist, and he ruminated, he speculated. They were not quite my image of science. They were not experimental, they were reflective and philosophical. So that's what hooked me.
And this was a time when a lot of historians of science and technology began their careers or early careers as scientists or engineers, or at least in graduate school in those areas.
Yeah, I didn't, although we are both now in the history of science, and you have a proper degree in the history of science, I didn't even know that the field of the history of science existed as a graduate program. So when I was an undergraduate and looking for graduate programs, I pursued intellectual history. And there were 2 programs, one at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore, so I could have come to Baltimore first, and there was another at Brandeis University near Boston. So I chose intellectual history because it seemed very broad. And it was there that I was introduced to the history of science as a proper field. And I took courses with Stephen Toulmin, a philosopher there, also with Harold Burston, who was a historian of science who worked in the area of the history of geology. So I got into the subject through them.
So there weren't any actual Darwin experts, so to speak, in your program at the time you were looking for something to do?
Absolutely not. But as you know, Boston is a very academic city, and as soon as I got interested in Darwin, I went over to the Museum of Comparative Zoology at Harvard University, which had as its director Ernst Mayr, who was a famous evolutionary biologist. He lived to be 100. He died just a few years ago. And all the great literature pertaining to evolutionary ideas was at the museum. And they were very generous about letting graduate students from other schools use their collection.
And at this time, someone coming up in the history of science had a big decision to make. Were they going to do physical science or biological science? And depending on which one they took, they were going to enter one of the industries, the Newton scientific revolution industry or the Darwin industry, as it were. Yeah, Yet you seem not to have yet bumped into the major figures of the Darwin industry at that time.
I'm old enough that I was in the pre-industrial stage. So there was no Darwin industry, really. I think I would have been intimidated if there had been. But there wasn't, and as part of my graduate studies, I went to Cambridge, England, where Darwin's manuscripts are kept. And I was almost incredulous because I got to the manuscript room and I started ordering Darwin manuscripts, and they came and they were opened, and these were unpublished manuscripts from the Beagle Voyage, page after page after page, and quite legible handwriting. And these had never been published, and I was just astonished and thrilled. So there was a lot to do, clearly, and I now know that the Darwin manuscripts had only recently come into the public domain. They had been in family hands through the period of World War II. They first had a hand list put together in 1960. I was looking at them in the late 60s. And people had not had the chance to look at them before. So there was a lot of interesting, fresh work to be done.
A certain amount of ignorance in picking your dissertation topic is always good.
Yes.
Because once you're into it, then you can't turn back.
Once you stumble into it, right. So.
But how did you make the decision to go to Cambridge and, as it were, dive into the manuscripts?
Oh, well, this is a good example of how scholars genuinely do help each other. I wrote a letter to a man named Robert Stauffer, who taught in the History of Science program at Wisconsin-Madison. Complimented him on an article he'd written on Lyell, the geologist, and Lyell's views of ecology. And he, instead I was doing my dissertation under Stephen Toulmin at Brandeis on Darwin, and he wrote back a nice letter and said, well, of course you have to go to Cambridge. And it wasn't like maybe you will or maybe you won't. It was, of course you have to go. So I wrote to my funding agency. I'd gotten a dissertation year fellowship from the Woodrow Wilson Foundation to say, may I have $600 to go to England to do this work? And I got a letter back that said, you should have asked earlier when you applied for this, but okay. So the $600 just paid for the round trip airfare. So, and I was also complicated by the fact that I was pregnant. So, you know, I had to go over there, do my work, and get back within the right time, or I would have a British subject instead of an American citizen.
Did you go alone?
Yeah, I went alone.
Except for your child, of course.
Young people are amazing, take a lot of risks. I now look back and I think, what was I thinking? But yeah.
So what was it like to open up these manuscripts, which almost nobody had seen? Your first day there, how did that go? Well,
you order them and they are delivered to your desk within minutes. And then you open the big brown bound volumes, and there on beautiful paper is Darwin's handwriting, the dates, places he visited, Buenos Aires, Rio, and his specimen numbers in the left-hand column and text on the right. And you're paging through this and you can hardly believe that this is the real thing, that this is the original. So it's quite thrilling, and you feel lucky to be there, lucky to have this opportunity.
And in those days, extensive copying was pretty much out of the question, but could you get copies at all?
They were photographed, and this is how they do it with manuscripts. They don't want to put manuscripts upside down on a photocopy machine generally. They open them up, and then a camera overhead takes a picture, and then you have to get copies off that. But at this time, you know, these originals had no photographic copies, so if there had been a fire, that would have been it.
So 6 weeks, brand new opened manuscripts, and pretty much your ability to write and take notes on them before you have to come back.
Yes, it was really 3 weeks. But the nicest thing, shows, and I'll give you an example how sometimes it's nice to not have much money and be a graduate student. I had booked my flight to come back on a Monday since it was cheaper than flying on the weekends. So I went down to London. The library closed on Saturday noon. I went down to London, met up with a friend who was in medical school. He took me to St. Thomas's Hospital. It was the only surgery I ever witnessed, so, you know, got in on what his training was. Then Sunday I had nothing to do. So I went out to Darwin's house, which is on the outskirts of London, thinking I was just going to be a tourist. And, you know, you have a day in London, you don't want to waste it. This also shows it's good to be young. So I got out there, and it took all day taking buses to get out there. And I'm looking around at everything, and then I notice there's a cabinet on the wall, and it has some notebooks in it. And you know, I look and I look and I look, and I finally get up my courage to ask the caretaker if I could have a look at the notebooks and explain what I'm doing. And he says yes. So he sits me down in the chair where Darwin wrote The Origin of Species. It was a chair with big arms. Darwin, and it had casters on it, wheels on it, so he would scoot around his room so he could move around quickly. And he didn't even write at a desk. He had a big breadboard that he put across the arms of his chair. And that's where he did all his writing. Okay, so he sat me down there with these notebooks. And I was just sort of casually interested in seeing them. They turned out to be Beagle Voyage field notebooks. But then I hit something that really interested me. when I was at Cambridge, I had been looking for the point at which Darwin became an evolutionist. And I'd read all of his zoological notes from the voyage and all the geological ones, and I hadn't really found him being an evolutionist. And that was a point, even then, that it wasn't quite sure when he crossed the line and adopted evolution. So I'm sitting in this chair reading, and I hit this notebook and it says, if one species does change into another. Whoa. I mean, I thought, I found what I'm looking for. This is it. And all of a sudden I decide to copy the notebook, so I start writing. And, the museum is supposed to close, and I talk to the curator, and he says, don't worry. So I finish copying it out, and he drives me to the train station. And that is the Red Notebook of Darwin's Red Notebook, which I published. And it's a key document because we now know when Darwin became an evolutionist. He became an evolutionist not during the voyage, but after the voyage in March of 1837. Months after he got back from the voyage, but still after. So that was a wonderful moment, and it wouldn't have happened if I had had enough money to fly home on the weekend.
Sitting in Darwin's own chair,
yes,
reading his notebooks,
yeah,
which, for all we know, he had been the last one to gaze eyes on if they'd been sitting at the country house.
Well, they wouldn't. Yeah, no. He definitely. His wife would have had them, and so on. They would have passed through a number of hands. But no, you do feel the man is around and his family's around, and yeah, you feel very closely connected. And he had the habit of cutting pages out of his notebooks when he wanted to file that sheet, like an index card for something else. And he used his wife's embroidery scissors. So instead of having a little straight line across the page, it's a little, and you can. So it was a household that worked together.
Mm-hmm. It seems like we're watching the Darwin industry being born.
Oh yeah, a lot of people working on Darwin were Americans, and I think one of the reasons for that is that there has always been a sort of hesitant attitude towards evolution in the U.S., more than, say, in England. And just a little bit of controversy draws interest. So people got interested and they wanted to figure it out for themselves. So there's quite a few Americans involved. And then at the time when I started in the 1960s, the big thing in biology at the University of Cambridge was DNA, which was the code, the genetic code. After all, Francis Crick and Jim Watson had unraveled the story of the code in Cambridge. So molecular biology was the coming aspect of biology in Cambridge in the 1960s. And Darwin was looked at as nice and old-fashioned and sort of natural history, and that was a stage that biology had to go through before it got to be real science. So there was, at that time, in the 1960s, there were only a couple people in Cambridge, both of whom I got to know fairly quickly because they were glad to have other people who were interested. And both of those two people, actually, we combined efforts and we did the big volume on Darwin's notebooks, Sidney Smith and Peter Gautry. So they and Paul Barrett, who was at Michigan State, and David Cohn, who was working on the Darwin Correspondence Project. So 3 Americans and 2 British scholars, we put this big volume together.
And so in a certain sense, you're supplying other scholars with absolutely essential material, not just Darwin's words, but contextual things and explanatory footnotes and so forth.
Oh yes, and tracking down this literature, which was very time-consuming. And by the way, although it was that volume was published in 1987, and it was just reissued this summer in honor of the anniversary year, but it's also available for free online. One of our co-editors, David Cohn, has a website called what does he call it? The Digital Library of Evolution, Darwin, something like that. It operates out of the American Museum of Natural History in New York. And he has had this all scanned, and so you can do a word search on these documents. You can not only get the full text as it looks in the book, but you can actually do a word search. So you want to say, did Darwin ever write anything about tigers? Or did he write anything about the state of Maryland? He did. You can just type that in the search bar and it comes up. So, and that's available for free.
So with all of the other knowledge about Darwin in the interim and treatments of him in biographies, how did you choose to research and write about him as a geologist?
I was aware that he wrote twice as much on geology during the Beagle voyage as on zoology or botany or any other subject. So I knew how much it interested him. And then in the Red Notebook, he also talks about the geology turning out simple, the geology of the whole world turning out simple. And what he had in mind was that all of geology could be understood if you understood the vertical motion of the Earth's crust, its rise and its fall. He thought these were balanced movements. He had published a whole book on coral reefs premised on this. And so he had a very big idea before he ever got to evolution. Then Louis Agassiz, author of the glacial hypothesis, came along and sort of busted up Darwin's notion of up-down motion being the whole story. Agassiz introduced the notion of glaciers affecting the landscape. Darwin fought this idea very hard, but he eventually had to admit that Agassiz had a good point. And this whole bubble Darwin had put together of an up-down motion of the Earth's crust became less the whole story once the glacial hypothesis was introduced. So that big idea sort of fades after 10 years. I thought that was interesting that Darwin had this one big idea. It didn't work out quite the way he wanted. He let it he took what he could from it and let it contract. And then he had this other big idea, evolution, and that continued to grow and grow and grow. But he had to shift his interests. And he was also, even when he was working on evolution, pretty tentative at points. You know, he said, sometimes I think about how long people have worked on ideas and then they turn into big puffballs that just sort of break up. So for 20 years, Darwin worked on this idea of evolution through natural selection, and he wasn't really 100% sure that it was going to turn out to be true. He thought there were parts of it that were true, but he was always very humble and tentative. And he was that way partly because he had seen his first big idea on geology not exactly explode, but definitely be challenged and have to be reworked. So there's this humility to a lot of his writings that is attractive and also realistic given what his own experience, his discovery had been.
So we have Charles Darwin, geologist, and then we have Sandra Herbert, geologist. Because you, in addition to doing research in libraries and archives and with manuscripts, you felt the need to actually go into the field.
Oh yeah, you read about what people do and you sort of want to see for yourself. Like on this glacial business, Darwin eventually went to Wales to see some evidence of former glaciation. Former glaciers often leave their marks because glaciers are very heavy and they sit on rock and they scratch the rock as the glacier is sliding over the rock. The glaciers moved seasonally. So Darwin wanted to see some evidence of this movement. So he went up there when he was in his early 30s and looked around Wales and said, yeah, he said, it takes a while to get a good glacial eye, but now I can see it. Well, I wanted to see too. So I hooked up with someone who was experienced in the geology of the area, and we went around and looked at some of these things and took some photographs. And you want to see what the other person saw and see. Also, you think, would I have recognized this in the field, or how would this have looked to me if I came at it green? So that was one example. Now, Wales is fairly easy to get to from London, but this most recent project that I've worked on with geologists has been much more of a challenge because it was in the Galapagos archipelago. And you can only do research in the Galapagos with permission, and the area where we wanted to do research was an uninhabited island. And there was a problem with it because Darwin said he collected a certain sort of rock there, and it was the origin of a theory about rock differentiation that he had that he published in 1844. And some more recent researcher had been there in 1964 and said, I can find no evidence of the rock Darwin said he brought home, and the rock that's now at Cambridge, and possibly a mistake was made in assigning it. Possibly this rock Darwin didn't collect there, and because it doesn't seem to be there. Well, that was a challenge. Was Darwin a good field researcher or not? And this was, the person making this claim had done so during what was called the Galapagos International Scientific Project year. It was something operating out of the California Academy of Sciences, done in 1964. So we got together a team of 2 geologists, one from the University of Idaho, one from the two from the University of Cambridge, and a historian, me, and we put together a plan to go to the Galapagos and see whether this rock was there. And luckily, it is. The person who had investigated the area in 1964 just didn't go far enough upland to find it. And this was a case also where being a historian helped the project, because the person who had done this work in 1964 did not read Darwin's manuscripts. If he had read Darwin's manuscripts from the site, he would have realized that these specimens were very carefully correlated to sites, and he would have had a clue to where to look. And he wouldn't have suggested that Darwin, by implication, wasn't such a hot field researcher. So, it's a case where historians had something to bring to the enterprise. And then, of course, it was thrilling to me to be with 2 people, one of whom, Dennis Geist from the University of Idaho, is possibly the world's expert currently on igneous processes in the Galapagos. And Sally Gibson, whose own area of expertise is on rock differentiation, and they use extremely complicated machines to analyze these rocks now. They look for trace elements, and you identify sites where a specimen was collected if it has the same trace element. So, they can tell you exactly where these rocks were collected, pretty exactly. Geology has a lot in common with history in that you can never rerun the past, and geologists try to imagine what has gone on in the past, and for historians it's the same. Also with geology, you're always having to sample an area, and do you miss something? Is there something there you haven't seen? But it was great fun for me to be with these 2 people. And then David Norman, the head of the Sedgwick Museum, who's in charge of Darwin's rocks, was there, and he's a paleontologist, so he brought a lot to the field too. So this whole enterprise was very much a team effort, and it was science and history working together.
Yes, I did want to ask about the last several years, because we had a big anniversary that I know you saw coming far down the road. Yeah. And you took advantage of that opportunity to make yet another transformation in the way in which you deal with historical materials, in the way in which you bring them to the public. You've gotten into exhibition of objects at museums like the Smithsonian, the Darwin commemorative activities at Cambridge, and also electronic publishing and internet-based materials as well. Tell us about how the Darwin celebration came along the road to you, and how you decided what to do about it.
This was quite surprising to me. I didn't know that it would be involve so many people. I started hearing in 2005 from people saying, look, Darwin was born in 1809, and the 200th anniversary of his birth is coming up in 2009. Would you like to do this symposium or do this or that? And the Smithsonian, the thing that was most new to me was working on this exhibit for the Smithsonian libraries. They have quite a fine collection of Darwin material, and they wanted to put it on display for the anniversary. So I was asked through Ellis Jokelson, who was a paleontologist there, if I would work on it, and of course I was delighted. And so we were able to put out materials that they had, not things exactly that Darwin collected, but like things that Darwin collected. So we put out the mockingbirds from the Galapagos that were so important to Darwin, and they have a suite of specimens quite like those he collected. we put out something from every area. We also have scans from the Cambridge Herbarium collection of his botanical works. They're on display, and then we have these rocks because we wanted to have something from geology too. And we also had some manuscript material because Joseph Henry, who was then head of the Smithsonian, read Darwin's Origin of Species in the early 1860s. The Origin of Species was published in 1859. Henry reads it a couple years later, and he becomes convinced by Darwin's argument. So we were able to put some of Henry's letters on display. Well, Cambridge University was Darwin's alma mater. He went there in the late 20s and got his degree in 1831. And he's one of their famous graduates. They have many famous graduates, of course. Christ College, which was his college, also has as one of its graduates John Milton, the poet John Milton. And of course, Isaac Newton went through Cambridge. So many famous graduates. But the university was eager to claim him and to honor him. So that became quite an elaborate venture. The university was also celebrating its 800th anniversary as a university the same year. So there were many events going on. And I got involved in it because I was at Christ College, Darwin's College, during the 2006-07 academic year, and they were planning what they were going to do. One of the things they did was to have a new statue cast, a bronze statue of Darwin as a student. And so if you go to Christ College today, you can have your photograph taken with Darwin's, or someone will have to hold the camera. That's not a concession. But I mean, you can go in there, you can have a look at the statue, and one of their former students did the statue. So that was quite interesting. And then there were a series of lectures and so on from that year forward. I did one of those. And they had a huge, what they called a Darwin Festival this year. 1 week of papers, concerts, exhibits, like nothing I've ever seen in academia.
Finally, I always like to ask anyone, what have I failed to ask you that you wanted me to ask you about?
Students, yeah, it was student interest here at UMBC. I taught a course on Darwinism, the evolutionary perspective, pretty much every year for about 30 years or something. So I think finding out, sort of passing the torch, that's been a very pleasant aspect of teaching, and we sort of all grow up together.
Well, I know that before you pass the torch anymore, you have much more to do. But we'll bring this to a close now, and thank you so very much for spending time with us.
Thank you, Joe.